Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, if you are staring down a massive psychology exam right now and just feeling totally overwhelmed by a mountain of disconnected terms, take a deep breath. You are in the absolute perfect place. Today, we're not just going to sit here memorizing dry facts. We are building a master map of the human mind, and we'll be zooming all the way from the microscopic internal workings of the brain right out to the macro, societal level of how we interact with the world around us.
But before we get into the heavy academics and the nitty-gritty terminology you need to know for your test, let's just activate your brain with a really fundamental question. Seriously, think about it for a second. What makes you, you? Are you just this biological machine running on a set of inherited genetic code, or are you entirely the product of the neighborhood you grew up in? Keep that tension in the back of your mind, because it's kind of the driving force behind almost everything we're about to cover.
So, to build this mental map, here is our game plan. We'll start with the science of mind, look at how we process our world, explore what makes us unique, trace growing through the lifespan, and finally, look at real-world psychology applications.
All right, Section 1, the science of mind, focusing on the origins of studying behavior. Let's dive right in.
You know, for centuries, understanding the mind was pretty much just a philosophical debate about the soul. But then, in 1879, a guy named Wilhelm Wundt completely changed the game. He set up the very first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany. And here's a fun fact that's actually a great way to remember him for your exam. His very first experiment was literally just measuring how long it took people to press a telegraph key after they heard a ball hit a platform. Sounds incredibly basic, right? But that specific shift, from people just sitting around debating philosophy to actually taking measurable empirical data, that is the exact birth of modern psychology.
Moving on to Section 2, processing our world, or what I like to call the human operating system.
So, how do we actually process the world? Think about riding a bike, or maybe the smell of your absolute favorite dinner. Memory is not just tossing files into a static metal cabinet. It's this highly dynamic, three-stage process. First up is encoding. That's taking in the world through your senses. Next is storage, which is where your brain actively holds on to that information. And finally, retrieval, actually pulling that file out of the drawer when you need it. If you break even one link in this chain, the whole memory fails.
To lock in the right terminology for your exam, you need to remember that long-term memory, or LTM, is the ultimate storage destination of that three-step process. It holds everything, literally everything, from your earliest childhood memory to the lyrics of a song you haven't heard in a decade. So hey, when you forget where you put your keys this morning, don't blame your LTM, blame your encoding.
Up next is Section 3, what makes us unique? Let's talk about intelligence and personality.
If we all have similar cognitive operating systems, if we're all encoding, storing, and retrieving, why in the world do we react to things so differently? Well, this brings us to the ultimate psychological heavyweight bout, nature versus nurture. On one side, you've got nature, your genetic code, the biological attributes you inherit. On the other side, nurture, your environment, your childhood experiences, your culture. For your exam, please remember this. Modern psychology almost never picks just one winner here. It's pretty much always a really complex interaction between the two.
Now, when it comes to measuring intelligence, it's fascinating to watch how the theories evolved over time. Charles Spearman started off pretty simple, arguing for one massive innate G factor that basically rules all of your cognition. But then Thurstone came along and disagreed, splintering intelligence into 7 independent abilities. After that, Sternberg simplified it back down to a triarchic model: analytical, creative, and practical. And finally, Howard Gardner just blew the doors entirely off the concept with his 8 multiple intelligences. He argued that being socially brilliant or physically gifted is just as vital as being good at math.
Beyond just intelligence, our unique personalities can be mapped out using Gordon Allport's hierarchy of traits. Think of it like a pyramid. At the very top are cardinal traits. These are incredibly rare, overwhelming obsessions that basically define a person's entire life. Think of Mother Teresa's altruism. But for the rest of us mere mortals, we are mostly governed by 5 to 10 central traits. These form the core of who we are, like being generally loyal or intelligent. And down at the bottom are secondary traits. These are just situational behaviors. Like maybe you have a friend who is normally super quiet, but they absolutely lose their mind yelling at a sports game. That's a secondary trait.
Let's keep zooming out. Section 4, growing through the lifespan. Think of this as how your system updates over time.
Okay, for your exam, you absolutely must grasp this fundamental debate.
Is growth a smooth ramp? Meaning, is it a continuous, gradual accumulation of skills over time without any sharp stages? Or is it more like a staircase, a discontinuous process, where we leap into discrete, abrupt stages and totally new behaviors just emerge all of a sudden?
Well, Erik Erikson's theory is basically the ultimate staircase model. He argued that we climb through life by facing very specific psychosocial crises at specific ages. For example, as a tiny infant, you face trust versus mistrust. You're literally just figuring out if your caregiver and the world are safe. Fast forward to age 65 and beyond, and that crisis becomes integrity versus despair as you reflect back on your whole life. The major takeaway here? Successfully resolving one step is what gives you the psychological strength to climb up to the next one.
And this leads us perfectly into Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. I want you to picture this as expanding ripples in a pond, with you right in the center. The microsystem is your immediate family and friends. The mesosystem is how those inner circles connect, like how your home life affects your school life. But look at how far out this goes. The exosystem means that if your parent has a highly stressful workplace, that indirectly impacts your development at home. And the whole thing is enveloped by the macrosystem of cultural laws and values. It just goes to show, we absolutely never grow in a vacuum.
All right, final stretch, Section 5, Real-World Psychology Applications, how we operate in the network.
When people hear psychology, clinical psychology is usually what comes to mind, right? It's the diagnosis and treatment of severe psychological disorders using psychotherapy. But, and this is a massive trap for exams, so listen up, clinical psychologists generally hold PhDs or PsyDs. That means, unlike psychiatrists, they are not medical doctors and generally cannot prescribe medication. Do not forget that distinction.
Now, if you are into true crime podcasts or documentaries, you've definitely seen forensic psychology in action. This is what happens when the science of the mind walks into the courtroom. It's the direct intersection of psychology and the criminal justice system. We're talking about everything from assessing crime victims and giving expert legal testimony to building complex criminal profiles to catch perpetrators based entirely on behavioral patterns.
And just to show you how incredibly far this science extends, we even have aviation psychology. Flying a commercial aircraft is a high-stakes, ridiculously stressful job. The aviation industry relies heavily on cognitive psychology to manage pilot stress, to test the absolute limits of human perception, and to use human engineering to design aircraft displays that minimize the chance of errors. It's a real game changer where applied psychology is literally saving lives every day.
So look at that. We have traveled all the way from the microscopic firing of a single encoded memory right out to the massive societal forces that shape a lifetime. As you prep for your exam, my challenge to you is this. Don't just memorize these concepts as a list of dead facts. Actually look in the mirror. Which of Gardner's multiple intelligences is your personal secret weapon? What invisible macrosystems are quietly dictating the choices you make every single day? Once you really master this map, you aren't just going to ace your test. You're going to crack the code to the most complex, unpredictable, and fascinating machine on Earth, yourself. So what are you going to decode first?